Chapter 2 of Charles Sumner, The Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Preparation and Progress. Every time a great man comes on the stage of human affairs, the fable of Hercules repeats itself. He gets a sword from Mercury, a bow from Apollo, a breastplate from Vulcan, horses from Neptune, a rope from Minerva. That is, many streams from many sources bring to him their united strength. How otherwise would the great man be equal to his hour and task? This wonderful truth, sealed within the myth, found fresh manifestations in the life of Sumner. The year after his graduation from Harvard College, viz. 1830-31, he spent at his home in the midst of books, which he continued to devour with increasing voracity. His truly extraordinary acquisitiveness sucked up the contents of books during the year as a huge sponge thrown into a tub of water sucks up the water. There was undoubtedly too much of the sponge-like absorption of the contents of books, and not enough of proper digestion and assimilation of them, but on the whole the pabulum served fairly well to nourish the bone and muscle-forming processes of his rapidly developing mind. And so the 12 months were not wasted, but added rather their contribution of acquisition and reflection to the great preparation. The year was, however, not altogether a happy one for the young scholar. He needed appreciation, sympathy, but from his family he got neither. Not that they were wanting in natural affection, not at all, but only in the expression of the real love and pride with which they regarded him. They were evidently a rather cold, undemonstrative household. This was, as regards the father, particularly true. His severe and sombre temper exerted, in all probability, a repressing and depressing influence upon his children, excluded too early and too much the sunshine from their young faces and hearts, and in consequence cut them off from those mutual and pretty confidences and intimacies which are the charm of domestic life. Sumner, with his unusual development of the bump of approbativeness, felt this lack of his family very keenly. He yearned for appreciation, for encouragement. To him, with his growing ego, these things were food and drink. Their want was no light affliction. To one of his old college mates, Jonathan F. Stearns, he wrote, "I think of hitching upon the law at Cambridge this coming commencement. I'm grateful for the encouraging word you give me. I'm rather despondent, and I meet from none of my family whose vivifying expressions, which a young mind always heartily accepts. My father says naught by way of encouragement. He seems determined to let me shape my own course, that if I am wise, I shall be wise for myself, and if I am foolish, I alone shall bear it." This experience, painful as it was to Sumner, was, after all, not a bad thing to happen to the youth. It kept within moderation the growth of the ego, which needed but the fallow soil of demonstrative family affection and hero worship to cause it to shoot up and out beyond all true proportions to the rest of his faculties. The steady current of this family north wind snubbed the tendency to put forth too rapidly on the egoistic side of the son's character, and so preserved a proper balance of his forces. And this was of the utmost importance to him, both in receiving and giving, especially just then in respect of the first of these functions. On contact and association with superior minds, he was to obtain no insignificant share of his outfit for the great part which later he was to play in the history of his country. At the end of these months at home, this new source of incalculable influence was opened to the young man by the sight of that full stream which was flowing into his mind from the Pyrrhean spring of books. Thenceforth they were to carry to him in parallel channels knowledge and wisdom. The choice of a profession and his return to Cambridge may be said to mark the end of the first and rudimentary stage of Sumner's apprenticeship and the beginning of its second and more serious term. The thoughts and feelings of boyhood were left altogether behind the young man, who became thereafter wholly taken up with the things that belong to manhood and to the estate of a scholar. The passion for labor, for excellence, burned with new ardor within him. In his scholarly enthusiasm, time appeared to him as more precious than silver, and it seemed that every moment, like a filing of gold, ought to be saved. The ideal of the lawyer which he hung up in his mind was of the loftiest. "A lawyer must know everything," wrote the young disciple of Blackstone to a friend. "He must know law, history, philosophy, human nature; and if he covets the fame of an advocate, he must drink of all the springs of literature, giving ease and elegance to the mind and illustration to whatever subject it touches." For the opposite of this noble ideal, the mere practitioner, he had thus early acceded loathing. "I'd rather be a toad," said he, "and live upon a dungeon's vapour, than one of those lumps of flesh that are christened lawyers, and who know only how to wring from quibbles and obscurities that justice which else they never could reach, and who have no idea of law beyond its letter, nor of literature beyond their term, reports, and statutes. If I am a lawyer, I wish to be one who can dwell upon the vast heaps of law matter as the temple in which the majesty of right has taken its abode, who will aim beyond the mere letter at the spirit, the broad spirit of the law, and who will bring to his aid a liberal and cultivated mind." And significantly enough, the moral and humane aspects of his chosen profession strongly attracted him to it from the start. It was not merely the lucre and the fame which it offered him, though they, of course, had their influence, especially the latter, but beyond and above the purely personal benefits which the law held for its votaries, he discovered another and nobler element, an altruistic good. The lawyer, if worthy of his high calling, was the custodian of social justice, the guardian of the sources of the rights of person and of property, the champion of civil and political liberty. According as he shapes his course, he may be one of the best or worst of men. He may be a fomenter of quarrels between man and man, or a healer of their dissensions. He too may be a real evangel, a proclaimer of peace and goodwill on earth, may be the lawyer as truly as ever minister of religion was. For as our student reasoned, religion exists independent of its ministers, every breast feels it, but the law lives only in the honesty and learning of lawyers. He was keenly alive to the splendid opportunities which the legal profession presented to him of unselfish service to his kind, and almost even then exaltedly conscious of the corresponding responsibilities which they imposed upon him as a friend of man. His letters at this period are full of the ardor of the scholar and the moral glow of disinterested desire. In his teachers, Judge Story, Professor Ashman, and later Professor Greenleaf, he was fortunate indeed. The relationship which almost immediately sprang up between him and each of these eminent men was one of mutual and intimate friendship, embracing at once the pride and affection of the master for a favorite pupil, and that pupil's ardent admiration and devotion in return. Sumner's industry and enthusiasm, his singleness of purpose, and the breadth of his intelligence were enough to attract to him the eyes of quite ordinary instructors, but his teachers were not ordinary masters of the law, and so these qualities of the disciple drew them to him as to a kindred spirit. The tie between them seemed half paternal, half fraternal. Sumner was a sort of professional son and heir to their chairs and learning, a kind of younger comrade and brother in their labors and achievements. The second of these professors Sumner helped to nurse during his last sickness, and watched alone by his couch when he died. And it was he, the faithful disciple, who collected funds for a monument with which to mark the last resting place of the dead friend and master. His privileges were great, but never did pupil value them more highly than did Sumner. With Judge Story his relations were peculiarly close. He was the jurist's correspondent when absent in Washington and on his circuit, keeping him the while in touch with the happenings of the university in general and with those at the law school in particular. Many were the kindly offices which the pupil performed for the master during these months when the duties of the Supreme Court engaged his presence elsewhere. Nothing could exceed the beauty of the friendship between the older and the younger man. The regard of the judge for Sumner was shared by his family. In it the favorite pupil was like an older son, and no son could indeed watch with livelier interest and satisfaction the growing fame of the great jurist as judge and publicist. Between Sumner and the professor's son, William W. Story, then a mere slip of a boy, there sprang up an altogether charming friendship, a repetition in miniature of that between the father and Sumner. That boy, since famous in art and literature, has preserved his recollections of his and his father's friend. They were written many years later, after the death of that friend in fact, but the years could not rob them of the freshness and grace of those green and fragrant days when he made the acquaintance of the tall, ungainly law student, whose personality and conversation so fascinated him that, in his own words, "When I heard that he was in the room, I quitted all occupations to see and hear him, though for the most part I only played the role of a listener." Many an evening he used to spend with Sumner at his room in the Dane Law School, reading Latin with him and talking with him over the ancient authors. Sumner, with his erudition and enthusiasm, had the art to render these evenings most agreeable to the boy. He talked of Cicero and Caesar, William Story recalled 40 years afterward, of Horace, Virgil, Tacitus, Sallust, and indeed of all the old Latin writers, of the influence they had on their age, and their age had on them, of the characteristics of their poetry and prose, of the peculiarities of their style, of the differences between them and our modern authors, and he so talked of them as to interest and amuse me, and bring them before me as real and living persons out of the dim, vague mist in which they had hitherto stood in my mind. We used then also to cap Latin verses, and he so roused my ambition not to be outdone by him that I collected from various authors a book full of verses, all of which I committed to memory. Of course he beat me always, for he had a facile and iron memory, which easily seized and steadily retained everything he acquired. This facile and iron memory was one of Sumner's principal endowments. It attracted the notice of the father as well as of the son. Judge Story remarked upon it and its characteristics at one of his Sunday evenings at the home of President Quincy. Said he, Sumner being the subject of conversation between those eminent men, "He has a wonderful memory. He keeps all his knowledge in order, and can put his hand on it in a moment. This is a great gift." It is undoubtedly a great gift, and it was to be of immense utility to its possessor in the leading role which later he was to enact on the stage of the Union. At the home of President Quincy in Cambridge, Sumner was a familiar and frequent visitor. Their friendship was lifelong, and it was Mrs. Quincy who, probably among the very first, foresaw a future for him. A daughter, Mrs. Waterston, remembered long years afterward the tall, spare form and honest face of Charles Sumner at her mother's Thursday evening receptions. In her journal she recorded her impressions of the young friend of her father. "This youth," she wrote, "though not in the least handsome, is so good-hearted, clever, and real, that it is impossible not to like him and believe in him." This seems to have been the universal opinion of his early friends. Serious he was, withal genial too. A capital talker, he was at that period a still more capital listener. Books he delighted in, but he delighted even more, if such a thing was possible, in intercourse with learned men. And as he valued and cherished his books, he valued and cherished not less his companionship with scholars and thinkers. Nothing could exceed the pious respect, nay, reverence even, with which he conducted himself toward his seniors, such as were President Quincy, Judge Story, and Professor Greenleaf, while toward his equals and his juniors in age he was the impersonation of kindliness, simplicity, and manliness. W. W. Story has preserved an amusing instance of the young law student's absorption in the pursuit of knowledge, and of his preference for the society of men over that of women. "Of all men I ever knew at his age," says Mr. Story, "he was the least susceptible to the charms of women. Men he liked best, and with them he preferred to talk. It was in vain for the loveliest and liveliest girl to seek to absorb his attention. He would at once desert the most blooming beauty to talk to the plainest of men. This was a constant source of amusement to us, and we used to lay wagers with the pretty girls that, with all their art, they could not keep him at their side a quarter of an hour. Nor do I think we ever lost one of these bets. I remember particularly one dinner at my father's house, when it fell to his lot to take out a charming woman, so handsome and full of esprit that anyone at the table might well have envied him his position. She had determined to hold him captive and win her bet against us, but her efforts were all in vain. Unfortunately, on his other side was a dry old savant, packed with information, and within 5 minutes Sumner had completely turned his back on his fair companion and engaged in a discussion with the other, which lasted the whole dinner. We all laughed. She cast up her eyes deprecatingly, acknowledged herself vanquished, and paid her bet. He had what he wanted, sensible men's talk. He had mined the savant, and as he mined every one he met in search of ore, and was thoroughly pleased with what he got. During the latter part of Sumner's law studentship at Cambridge, he held the post of librarian of the law library. It is said that so thoroughly and minutely did he know his domains that he could put his hand on any volume in the dark, but his knowledge of them, it need hardly be added, was by no means limited to their location on the shelves. It extended to their contents and authorships as well. There was scarcely a textbook among them with which he did not have more than a superficial acquaintance. He could tell, besides, the manner of men who had written them. When he read a book, he at once inquired after the man behind it, who had written it. He studied him, made him live and move before the mind's eye. Then he appropriated him and his works to himself and his friends forever after. He obtained thus a sort of incorporeal hereditament and fee simple in the labor and learning of other lives. During this period Sumner prepared a catalogue of the library, which by competent judges was considered excellent. Professor Story was especially well pleased with it, for it added, no doubt, not a little to the equipment and efficiency of the college as a place for study of the law. Amid incessant and excessive attention given to legal, classical, and literary readings and acquisitions, the young scholar began about this time to write for the American Jurist, a magazine devoted to juridical subjects and literature, and also for the American Monthly Review. His articles were learned and full of useful comment and research. To apply a phrase of Judge Story's in relation to one of them, to all of them. He found time also to compete for a Bodewin Prize, and to win it into the bargain. The contestants were limited to resident graduates who were required to write on the theme, "Are the most important changes in society effected gradually or by violent revolutions?" Sumner's thesis, adopted and enforced by a wide historical view of Europe during the Middle Ages, the doctrine of social evolution or gradualism as the most potent factor in the production of important changes in modern civil society. Nevertheless, he perceives the sublime utility of violent revolutions at emergent moments in the progress of humanity, and quotes John Milton, himself a revolutionist, in justification of them. For surely to every good and peaceable citizen it must in nature needs be a hateful thing to be the displeaser and molester of thousands. But when God commands to take the trumpet and blow a dolorous or a jarring blast, it lies not in man's will what he shall say or what he shall conceal. The evident admiration of the essayist for this stern sentiment of the great English reformer was one of those coming events which are reputed to cast their shadows before. Should God ever command him to take the trumpet and blow a dolorous or a jarring blast, it is clear that, like his Puritan kin across the sea, he would elect to obey God rather than men. Reading between the lines, we catch the high thought of the young scholar in respect of the part he meant to play, if it should please God to cast his lot amid similar circumstances. About this time he took a lively and practical interest in temperance reform, and when in March 1833 a society was organized in the university, he was chosen its first president. A peculiar life-and-death earnestness, says Reverend A. Livermore, the first vice-president of the society, characterized even then all that Sumner did and said. And Reverend Samuel Osgood, its first secretary, recalls that he had great strength of conviction on ethical subjects and decided religious principle, yet he was little theological, much less ecclesiastical. This description of the religious attitude of the young scholar finds confirmation in one of his private letters written in January 1833 to his friend Jonathan F. Stearns. "I am without religious feeling," he frankly confesses, and goes on with his self-revelation in this wise: "I seldom refer my happiness or acquisitions to the Great Father, from whose mercy they are derived. Of the first great commandment, then, upon which so much hangs, I live in perpetual unconsciousness. I will not say disregard, for that perhaps would imply that it was present in my mind. I believe, though, that my love to my neighbor, namely, my anxiety that my fellow creatures should be happy and disposition to serve them in their honest endeavors, is pure and strong. Certainly I do feel an affection for everything that God created, and this feeling is my religion. At the end of the year 1833, Sumner graduated from the Dane Law School and entered forthwith the office of Benjamin Rand in Boston to obtain a practical knowledge of procedure in the courts. This knowledge was necessary to his complete equipment for the career of a lawyer, which he was strongly desirous of pursuing. Nothing less than a sense of its necessity could have separated him at the time from the law school, which was growing fast and far in favor and fame under the brilliant professional management of his friends and masters, Story and Greenleaf. The college in the autumn of 1833 numbered upwards of 50 students, which was probably at that date the largest collection of young men who had ever gathered in one place in America for the study of the law. With the continued increase of students, there would presently come an addition to the teaching force of the school. Professor Story counted quite confidently on an early reinforcement of his own and Professor Greenleaf's labors in this regard, and with no less confidence on the return then of Sumner to the school as the new colleague. Indeed, so large a void was created in Cambridge by the absence of the young scholar that Judge Story urged him a few months after he had left for the law office in Boston to return to the school as an associate instructor therein. But Sumner was too firmly joined to his ambition for a forensic career to surrender it, even to oblige the judge or for the sake of enjoying academic honors and pursuits dearly as he loved both, and so the offer was declined. His refusal to return to Cambridge was not under the circumstances surprising, for he was, as all students of the law are apt to be, fascinated by the struggles and triumphs of the forum and desirous of following in the steps of the great advocates. Sumner, naturally enough, had his illusions in respect of his fitness for sustaining such a role, illusions which nothing less hard than experience was equal to breaking. But whoever undertakes to practice law will find that in whatever else he may be lacking, it will not be in experience. Clients may fail, but experience will never, experience of an altogether disillusioning sort, as multitudes of young aspirants for the mantles of Erskine and Choate learn them every year at the bar. Sumner, however, even in the neophyte state, was not without misgivings as to whether he possessed the qualifications indispensable to the successful practitioner in the rough and tumble of the arena of courts. His old classmate, John W. Brown, himself a lawyer, had not any doubt of Sumner's deficiency in the qualities essential to success in harsh everyday practice. "You are not rough-shod enough," Brown wrote him, "to travel in the stony and broken road of homely, harsh, everyday practice." He did not think that Sumner was fashioned for that kind of life, either by the hand of nature or in the school of experience. He had, indeed, lived among books and away from all except one class of mind. He knew books, but next to nothing of men, that is, the sort of men who do business before courts. Brown justly observed that all Sumner's inclinations and habits set him on with a strong tendency toward a green eminence of fame and emolument in his profession. "But you are not destined to reach it," he added sagely, "by traveling through the ordinary business of a young lawyer in the courts." He therefore urged Sumner to fall in with the offer of Judge Story and return to Cambridge. But Sumner, as we have already seen, was of another mind, and he accordingly persevered in his purpose to enter upon the harsh everyday practice of his profession, the invitation of Judge Story and the counsel of Brown to the contrary notwithstanding. Sumner was always for going to the fountainhead for any knowledge which he wanted, and as he was now acquainting himself with legal procedure and the conduct of causes, he turned to the Supreme Court at Washington as to a peculiarly fit place to pursue his studies. So in the winter of 1834, only a few weeks after his graduation from the law school at Cambridge, he betook himself off to the national capital. He went armed cap à pie with letters introducing him to various distinguished people in New York and Philadelphia, and with his eyes wide open to what there was to see and learn by the way. The journey in those days from Boston to Washington was made almost wholly in coaches and steamboats, for be it remembered that in 1834 the railroad era was but just beginning. The novelty of the new motor power of transportation by steam, when Sumner made his visit to Washington, produced the most agreeable sensations of surprise and wonder in the minds of travelers accustomed to the old means of locomotion by wind and horses. There is something partaking of the sublime, wrote Sumner to a 14-year-old sister, in the sense that you are going at the rate of 50 miles an hour, drawn by an insensible agent, the contrivance of man, who has sought out many inventions, enjoying, if you are in a boat, all the comforts and luxuries of the finest hotel, walking over carpets, or sitting at a table loaded with all the products of the season, or if in a railway car, enjoying at least a comfortable and easy seat from which you may see the country over which you are flying as a bird. At New York, our traveller visited Chancellor Kent, whose conversation he found lively and instructive, but grossly ungrammatical. In Philadelphia he renewed an old acquaintance with Mr. Richard Peters, the official reporter of the decisions of the Supreme Court, and was received into the family of the gentleman on most cordial and intimate terms. To a daughter of Mr. Peters, this generation of readers is indebted for a graphic sketch of our hero as he appeared then. When he came to Philadelphia in 1834, she says, he had finished his course at the law school, I think, but had almost put his eyes out with hard study, and was forced to come away for rest. He was then a great, tall, lank creature, quite heedless of the form and fashion of his garb, unsophisticated, everybody said, and oblivious of the propriety of wearing a hat in a city, going about in a rather shabby fur cap. But the fastidiousness of fashionable ladies was utterly routed by the wonderful charm of his conversation, and he was carried about triumphantly and introduced to all the distinguished people, young and old, who then made Philadelphia society so brilliant. No amount of honeying, however, could then affect him. His simplicity, his perfect naturalness, was what struck every one, combined with his rare culture and his delicious youthful enthusiasm. Here is an instance of his delicious youthful enthusiasm for an object other than knowledge. The picture is done by the same hand and belongs to the time of that first visit to Philadelphia. He was almost beside himself then over Fanny Kemble's acting. Used to walk, he said, that winter to and from Boston through snow and storm to see her act. One of my sisters had a singular ability in imitating this gifted woman's acting and reading, and it was Charles Sumner's delight to insist on this rather shy lady's performing for him. His exclamation was, "By George, that's fine! By George, that's fine! Miss S., give it to us again. Now, Miss S., the do-it point, the do-it point," from Sheridan Knowles's Hunchback, and striking his great hands together and heaving them about like Domine Samson, and striding up and down the room, he would keep repeating, "By George, that's fine." At Washington the young jurist obtained his soul's desire, viz., an opportunity of drinking at the national fountainhead of jurisprudence, whence were flowing the living waters of the law of a new country. Over the Supreme Court John Marshall, the great Chief Justice, still presided, and by his side, and second only to him in the judiciary of the land, sat Sumner's master, Joseph Story, one of the most learned jurists of the age, and there also sat McLean, who was subsequently to prove that, unseduced by circumstances and unawed by power, he was in independence and courage a lineal descent of the brave and liberty-loving judges of glorious old England. At its bar was gathered annually the flower of the forum of all the states, from that big-brained, deep-throated mastiff of litigious suitors, Webster himself, through the variedly and splendidly gifted and equipped forensic leaders of the time, who, with the erudite and illustrious judges who sat on the bench, made the Supreme Court then the Mecca of the American student of the law. Sumner's intimacy with Judge Story gave him almost a place in the court, where for a month he pitched his tent during several hours of each day. The judges he came to know quite well within and without the court. In 1834 they all put up at the same boarding house where Sumner was a nightly visitor. Judge Marshall he found a model of simplicity, naturally taciturn, and yet ready to laugh, to joke, and to be joked with. Within the bar Sumner saw a degree of negligence in the preparation of their cases by eminent counsel that made anything but an edifying spectacle for either gods or law students. To Professor Greenleaf he wrote of an instance of this character in which figured Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner, Walter Jones, and Daniel Webster. But here is Sumner's relation of the incident on the spot. Key has not prepared himself, and now speaks from his preparation on the trial below, relying upon a quickness and facility of language rather than upon research. Walter Jones, a man of acknowledged powers in the law, unsurpassed if not unequaled by any lawyer in the country, is in the same plight. He is now conning his papers and maturing his points, a labor which, of course, he should have gone through before he entered the court-room. And our Webster fills up the remus triumvirate. He, like Jones, is doing the labor in court which should have been done out of court. In fact, politics have entirely swamped his whole time and talents. All here declare that he has neglected his cases this term in a remarkable manner. It is now whispered in the room that he has not looked at the present case, though the amount at stake is estimated at $500,000. Nor was this, alas, the only example of that great man's capacity for neglecting the interests of his clients, of leaving undone the things which, as their retained attorney, he ought to have done, witnessed by Sumner during his stay at Washington. Politics had indeed, during the then session of Congress, swamped all of Webster's time and talents, and no wonder; for politics during those months, and in fact ever since the election of Jackson, were of an altogether unusual and engrossing character. Perhaps never in the history of the Republic has party excitement run higher than it did at this period. The removal of the Treasury deposits from Mr. Nicholas Biddle's Bank of the United States by an executive order was, at the date of Sumner's visit to the federal capital, the occasion of most extraordinary demonstrations against the President. Philippic followed Philippic against the determined old man, at whose head his political opponents were pleased to shy such epithets as tyrant, usurper, and other ridiculously extravagant appellations, all tending to advertise him as a sort of American Caesar or Bonaparte, bent on subverting the liberties of the Union, and at the same time to arouse against him such a storm of popular feeling as to blow him and his party clean out of the government, and to blow the aforesaid political opponents and their parties into possession of it. And so Sumner found those Neptunes of the political deep, Webster, Calhoun, and Clay, busy beating with their senatorial tridents the yeasty sea of national politics into waves and billows for the sake of whelming the before-mentioned usurper and tyrant, who, by the way, when Sumner saw him, appeared by very infirm to have hardly nerve enough to keep his bones together. Nevertheless, it is plain enough that the young scholar's sympathies were wholly against the old tyrant and with his enemies, to whose attacks in the Senate he listened eagerly, and from one of whom at least he was the recipient of marked attention. This was one no other than Webster himself, who introduced his young townsman to the floor of the Senate, giving him a card which enabled him at all times to gain access to the floor. Webster little dreamed that that young townsman of his was in the space of 18 years to succeed him on that floor, and impossible it was for Sumner to foresee the imposing part which he was to play as that great man's successor in that body. During these visits to the Senate, Sumner had not only the good fortune to hear Webster, but Calhoun and Clay as well, the second of whom he describes as no orator, very rugged in his language, unstudied in style, marching directly to the main points of his subject without stopping for parley or introduction. Clay's eloquence was splendid and thrilling. He wrote home, "There was not one there whose blood did not flow quickly," goes on our Bostonian, and pulse throbbed quickly as he listened. His language, without being choice, is strong, but it is his manner, or what Demosthenes called action, 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 which makes him so powerful. Sumner did not think that he would ever revisit Washington. "I've little or no desire," he wrote his father, "ever to come again in any capacity. Nothing that I have seen of politics has made me look upon them with any feeling other than loathing. The more I see of them, the more I love law, which I feel will give me an honorable livelihood." It was on the way between Baltimore and Washington that he had his first glimpse of the barbarism of slavery, the actual unadulterated article, and of its mildew effects upon the people and section where it existed. The whole country, he wrote his parents, was barren and cheerless. Houses were sprinkled very thinly on the road, and when they did appear, they were little better than hovels, mere log huts, which father will remember, though none else of the family may be able to conceive them. For the first time I saw slaves, and my worst preconception of their appearance and ignorance did not fall as low as their actual stupidity. They appeared to be nothing more than moving masses of flesh, unendowed with anything of intelligence above the brutes. I have now an idea of the blight upon that part of our country in which they live. That idea was never to be erased from the tablet of his mind, nor was that first frightful glance down into the depths of the slave system ever to be forgotten by him. It will not fail to be noted by the reader that in this first impression of slavery in the concrete on the part of Sumner, it was its political rather than its moral aspect which attracted his attention and excited his strong repulsion. In other words, it was the patriot, not the philanthropist, who animadverted on the degradation and ruin with which Southern slavery had doomed the Southern half of the Union. The active love of country preceded in the bosom of the young scholar the active love of man. First the blade, then the ear, then the full corn in the ear is the law of spiritual as well as of vegetable development. First family, then country, then humanity are the upward steps in the ethical progress and unfolding of the soul of man. Sumner's feet were in this royal road, and his earnest mind was turned truly Zionward, humanity-ward. In September of 1834 the young attorney was admitted to the bar and began at once to practice law, appearing in his first case, which was a criminal action, but a few weeks after his admission. He and George S. Hillard, his associate, successfully defended the accused, who was indicted for an attempt to violate the law for the prevention of dueling in Massachusetts. In November he and Hillard formed a partnership for the practice of the law and opened chambers on Court Street in Boston. There, if the partners did not get all the legal business which they could attend to, they succeeded fairly well in that line. But if troops of clients did not find their way to those rooms, troops of friends did. And what friends they were! They were, in fact, no small part of Sumner's education. Among those who dropped in on the young lawyers were men already famous in law, letters, and politics, who were destined to achieve fame in them all. There were Judge Story and Professor Greenleaf and C.C. Felton, the future president of Harvard University, and George Bancroft, the future historian of the United States, and Horace Mann, the future reformer and benefactor of his species, and Edward Greeley Loring, who, too, was some day to be talked about, though not exactly in the way of some of the others. Of Horace Mann, for instance, these and other choice spirits not named formed a goodly company of earnest, inspiring minds, the creme de la creme, so to speak, of the culture and character of the old town. Besides this larger circle of friends, there was later an inner and limited one of elect companions. They were called the Five of Clubs, and consisted of Henry W. Longfellow, C.C. Felton, Henry R. Cleveland, and of Hillard and Sumner, who was the youngest of the five scholars, who together made excursions over almost the whole field of human knowledge, and sat in judgment upon each other's writings as well. The goodly fellowship of such minds was in itself a liberal education. Such contact of intellect with intellect keeps all the faculties alert and in exercise, acts as a steady tonic upon them, develops the muscularity and robustness of the moral and intellectual life that no other one agency can perform quite as well. It was of great value to the brilliant young scholars who together formed the Five of Clubs, but to Sumner, with his omnivorous appetite for books and his enormous powers of acquisitiveness, the Five of Clubs must have been of inestimable value by strengthening his mental powers of digestion and assimilation of the vast amount of matter which he was constantly taking into the stomach of his intellect, if I may be allowed to use the expression. It gave him probably a mastery over the immense stores of his acquisitions, which he could not well have acquired, or at least so effectively, in any other way. It taught him to know himself, to gauge his relative strength, to measure his relative height in a company of equals. He, with the great work which the future held waiting for him to do, needed to know himself, to trust himself, to test himself, to learn to lean without a doubt upon himself through good report and evil. And what better preparation can one have for this self-faith, for a simple, virile reliance upon the might of one's very self, than a knowledge of that self, such a knowledge as a powerful mind must always obtain when thrown into frank, critical, earnest, and intimate association with its equals. If the young attorney's clients did not occupy all of his time was nevertheless wholly occupied to the last inch of it by other duties. In January 1835 he began to fill Judge Story's place at the law school during his attendance upon the sessions of the Supreme Court at Washington. Sumner's success in his new role of instructor in law was, according to Professor Greenleaf, in every way complete and gratifying. Judge Story wrote him from the Capitol, "I hope that this is but the beginning, and that one day you may fill the chair which he, Professor Greenleaf, or I occupy, if he or I, like autocrats, can hope to appoint our successors." A little later in the same year, Judge Story evinced still further his high estimate of his pupil's ability and learning by appointing him the reporter of his circuit court opinions. 3 volumes of Judge Story's opinions were subsequently published by Sumner. The first of them appeared in 1836, the second in 1837, and the third in 1841. The judge honored Sumner by a third appointment in 1835, viz., with a commissionership of the Circuit Court of the United States, an office which was to be resigned by the appointee many years afterward when it conflicted with his duties as a man. But we are anticipating. Besides labor of the above description, Sumner did no inconsiderable amount of editorial and special magazine work on the American Jurist, of which he and Hillard and Luther S. Cushing became editors in April 1836. The character of the numerous articles which appeared from his pen in the Jurist during this period shows quite clearly the literary bias of Sumner's tastes, which led him to write upon authors, books, and libraries, remarks Mr. Edward L. Pierce in his Memoir and Letters of Charles Sumner, rather than upon the law itself. In addition to his magazine work, he assisted Professor Greenleaf in the preparation of the general digest of his reports of the decisions of the Supreme Court of Maine, and Mr. Andrew Dunlap in the final revision of his Admiralty practice. There is one thing of which we may be sure, that in all of Sumner's editorial and magazine work, money was the last consideration thought of by him. He looked for his principal remuneration to the knowledge of the law which he would obtain through the doing of all this work. When he read law for an article, or as a collaborator of legal treatises, etc., he perceived that such readings were altogether different matters from other readings which had no purpose and end in view except the mere getting of information. He had expressed his own sentiment on this point in a letter to a young lawyer whom he had recommended as a fit person for editing a new edition of the Pickering Reports of Massachusetts. To Mr. J.C. Perkins he wrote, "Don't regard the money as the pay. It is the knowledge you will get, the stimulus under which your mind will act when you feel that you are reading law for a purpose and end other than the bare getting of information, every spur and ambition exciting you. Depend upon it, no engraver will trace the law on your mind in such deep characters. If I augur right, the 6 weeks in which I think you will accomplish it will be the most productive of your whole life. In them you will feel more palpably your progress than ever before in the same amount of time." Actuated by such a scholarly passion for knowledge, it was a foregone conclusion that every piece of work to which Sumner put his hands during these first years after his admission to the bar should react upon his faculties as an educator, should constitute a part of the great preparation which, all unconsciously, he was making for future eminence and usefulness to mankind. Writing to the same gentleman a little later, touching the same subject matter, Sumner recurs to the item of the mere money consideration of the engagement as compared with other less material advantages which would thereby inure to his friend. Says Sumner, "I still feel that the money will be the least advantage that you will reap. The practice, the self-confidence, without which, if properly tempered by modesty, nothing great can be done, the habit of looking up cases and of looking down upon the opinions of judges, and the wide and various learning, will be worth more to you than a governmental office." Sumner by no means despised money, but on the contrary fully recognized its utility in the pursuit of knowledge. As an instrument it was greatly to be desired, and was indeed greatly desired by him. But money as an end he did not want, considered it as such not worth the striving for, and when it lowered a student's aims or lessened his industry, its possession was no more nor less than the possession of an evil spirit, which required exorcism in the interest of the higher life of scholarship. To his friend Francis and Lieber he wrote, "You are one of the few men whom I wish to see with a fortune, because I believe you would use it as one who has God's stamp should. It will be only a novum organum for higher exertion. You love labor so lovingly, and drive it with such effect, that I would risk you with Croesus's treasury. Not all the pleasures and splendors which the devil of material wealth spread out before Sumner was able to tempt him, the young scholar of 24, by so much as a single thought, or act into apostasy from the simple and grand ideal of the seeker after knowledge, the lover of truth." A strong and interesting friendship sprang up between Sumner and Lieber, a man of encyclopedic range of mind, and of an extraordinary capacity for literary labor, and for turning out in the likeness and form of a new book whatever came to his mill. Sumner was a man after his own heart, who could be depended upon to keep the hopper of the great German replenished with bulging sacks of corn. Upon the young scholar Dr. Lieber made constant requisitions during the preparation of his books, and these drafts were honored in turn with a promptness and completeness which left nothing to be desired in the way of the information wanted. Sumner never tired of serving his friend. Now it was one thing, now another, was always seeking, in fact, to advance Dr. Lieber's fame and fortune. Here is the way the savant looked upon the aid and comfort rendered him by the young Boston scholar. "Let me thank you, my dear friend, most heartily," he wrote Sumner in 1837, "for your kind addition of stock to my work in your last. The interest I see you take in my book cheers me much. Contribute more and more. It will all be thankfully received. Only I'm afraid I shall be embarrassed how to use it. I cannot all the time say, contributed by a friend, and yet I do not want to plume myself with your feathers. And, my dear fellow, if I were not asking too much, I would beg you to grant me a pigeonhole in your mind while abroad. Say, if you would, a memorandum book with this title, All Sorts of Stuff for Lieber." Sumner was amply compensated for such services in his contact and correspondence with a scholar of so vast a range of knowledge and of such productive energies as was Francis Lieber. But even more highly than the good which he derived from association with a first-rate mind must be estimated the reading for a purpose and an end other than the bare getting of information, which the demands of Dr. Lieber must have more or less entailed upon him. To this early period must probably be referred the beginnings of Sumner's interest in the peace question. His friendship with Dr. Channing, which dates from the same period, had, it is not altogether unlikely, some influence in turning his attention to that subject. At any rate, we know that in April, 1835, interest in the peace question was taking root in his mind. Writing to Dr. Lieber touching several of the doctor's productions, Sumner speaks particularly of The Stranger in America, adding, "I think the Peace Society could do nothing better than reprint your chapter on Waterloo as a tract, or at least as an article in one of their journals. It gives the most vivid sketch I ever read of the horrors of war, because it embodies them in the experience of one individual, without resorting to any of the declamatory generalities which are generally used with that view." A little later in the summer of the same year, Sumner recurs to the subject to express his determination to have the doctor's sketch of the Battle of Waterloo published as a peace tract or as an essay in some journal of the Peace Society, and his intention to write an introduction in connection with it. During this period, Sumner began to take a lively interest in another reform. It was probably directly after the great mob in 1835, by which Garrison was dragged through the streets of Boston and nearly lost his life, that the young scholar began to read the Liberator. The excesses of the friends of slavery disgusted him, excited his hot indignation. Besides, too, the slave tyranny had struck him at home, in the person of his father, who came near losing his office, the reader will recall, owing to a pro-slavery outburst against him in the city for alleged negligence in the case of the two slave women referred to in the first chapter of this book. The assault upon Mr. Sewell by a slaveholder for the part taken by him in the rescue of the fugitives aroused Sumner's ire to an intense degree, as is evinced by a postscript to a letter of his from Montreal to George S. Hillard in the autumn of 1836. "How my blood boils," runs the postscript, "at the indignity to S. E. Sewell." To his friend Dr. Lieber, who was then domiciled in Columbia, South Carolina, Sumner had written as early as January, 1836, "You are in the midst of slavery, seated among its whirling eddies, blown round as they are by the blasts of Governor McDuffie, fiercer than any from the old windbags of Elis. What think you of it? Should it longer exist? Is not emancipation practicable? We are becoming abolitionists at the North fast. The riots, the attempts to abridge the freedom of discussion, Governor McDuffie's message, and the conduct of the South generally have caused many to think favorably of immediate emancipation who never before inclined to it. In sooth, Hercules is beginning to scent the Lernean hydra from afar." End of chapter 2.